Good day. In my two last videos, I have been discussing the way in which, despite President Biden's telephone call to Xi Jinping of China, in which he seemed to be working towards trying to stabilize the situation with China in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits and in the Pacific, and made clear to the Chinese leader that the United States is concerned to avoid an armed conflict with China, the situation between China and the United States continues to deteriorate, with the neocons acting to try and block any step for a rapprochement between the United States and China, or at the very least, a easing of tensions by flagging up the prospect of the United States agreeing to transform the Taiwan's mission in Washington, to a Taiwan representative mission, a step which would in effect signal to China and the world that the United States is treating Taiwan not as a seceded province of China, but rather as some kind of independent country. And predictably, this provoked a very strong reaction from Beijing, and we've seen over the last couple of days statements from the Chinese about how they are preparing or willing to send Chinese fighter jets to overfly Taiwan, an event which I think some people on the threads are underestimating the significance of if it happens. Anyway, it's very clear to me, as I discussed in my two recent programs, that there is a split about how to deal with China at the highest levels of the US government. On the one hand, you have the neocons and their various followers within the government and within the think tank community, who clearly want to see the situation with China continue to deteriorate, who believe that the correct policy for the United States is to confront China at every level, and who are clearly maneuvering to recognize the independence of Taiwan. Those people either welcome a military confrontation with China, which I find astonishing, or perhaps more plausibly believe that Chinese threats of military action are some kind of a bluff, which the United States would be able to call, and believe that if that were to happen, that would presumably destabilize and humiliate the Chinese government and perhaps place its legitimacy in China in doubt. That is the hardline faction. There is another faction, the faction I suspect which is strongest in the Pentagon, amongst the military leadership of the United States, who look on the deterioration of the relations with China in the Pacific with growing horror, who are deeply alarmed about the consequences and implications of a military clash with China, who are conscious that all the various war games that have taken place to try and find a means of defeating China in the Taiwan Straits, that they all show that the United States would lose and lose badly in such a military confrontation, and who are also worried about the evidence of China's nuclear weapons build-up, which the Chinese are engaging in, as the Chinese become ever more convinced that some kind of military confrontation, most probably over Taiwan, but possibly also over the South China Sea, between China and the United States is pending. And we have now seen that one of these more moderate forces, General John E. Hyten, who is the vice chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff and is the military official who is perhaps most intimately involved with the United States' nuclear deterrent forces, he's come out and said that our goal should be to never go to war with China, to never go to war with Russia, because that day is a horrible day for the planet, and a horrible day for our countries. And we have also seen another US official, US Admiral and former head of the US Pacific Command, Harry Harris, has also gone ahead and said it's very important that we do everything that we can to prevent an escalation and open warfare with China. These are the people in charge of the US's nuclear deterrent and also its naval forces, who are aware, perhaps better than some of the ground force commanders and some of the civilian officials and some of the neocon ideologues, about how dangerous the situation in the Pacific is becoming and how the neocon strategy of confrontation with China is far more likely to end in disaster for the United States than in disaster for China, and that it could very well be the case that it could end in a disaster for everybody in an uncontrolled nuclear war. And General Hyten went further and lamented the fact that whilst the United States is restricted as a result of its negotiations with Russia in the size of its nuclear deterrent, China is not so restricted and refuses to agree to any such restrictions. And General Hyten also lamented the fact that the United States has no regular communications with the Chinese military in the way that it has communications with the Russian military. So we see senior military officers in the US Navy and in the US Strategic Command worried about the deterioration of the relationship with China. And we see the neocons, on the contrary, itching for further confrontation with China. And we see the US government, the administration, trapped between these two competing forces, unable to decide which of these directions, which side the realists in the Pentagon, alarmed by the developments, or the ideologues, the neocon ideologues, probably strongest in the State Department, which of the two it is going to align itself with. And we saw Joe Biden briefly aligning with the military realists in the Pentagon on Friday, but when he called Xi Jinping. But we saw the following day, on Saturday, the neocons responding with the announcements, the information that the United States is edging towards a recognition of at least the de facto independence of Taiwan. So we see a deeply divided government there. But we're also seeing something else. And the Chinese, of course, are following and monitoring these events closely. And what they are undoubtedly taking from all of this is a sign of US weakness and also of US division. And we've now had an article appearing in Global Times which comments on these remarks of General Hyten and Admiral Harris, and which shows that the Chinese are fully aware of them and are drawing their own conclusions, but are providing their own advice, if you like, to the United States. Now, this article is not an editorial comment, but it is an article written by Hu Cixin, who is the editor of Global Times, and who is therefore somebody who is reflective of the views of the Chinese government. And in some ways, an article by Hu might be considered to be even more authoritative than an editorial by Global Times, because of its more personal nature, though I suspect that it's also possible in an article by Hu for the Chinese to explain the reasoning for their decisions. Anyway, I'm going to read parts of what Hu has written. And this is what he wrote. Recently, there have been more voices in the United States emphasizing that the United States should not have military conflicts with China. This is obviously because the tensions in the relations between the two countries have been escalating. The frontline troops are getting closer and closer, and the US has had real worries of accidental and serious confrontation between the two militaries and even accidental discharge of fires. The risk of a China-US military confrontation has increased. The reason is that the two countries' strategic hostility has continued to increase and their mutual trust has dropped to almost zero. Metaphorically, if the wind blows the door shut now, both countries would believe that the other side is slamming the door. If an incident like the 2001 in-flight collision in the South China Sea happens again today, it is difficult for the two sides to cool the incident down and resolve it peacefully. That was an incident, by the way, where a Chinese and US aircraft collided with each other in the South China Sea. Happened all the way back in 2001. Who rightly says that the implications of an incident like that would be far greater today. Anyway, we now come to the heart of his article. Who is to blame for such an awkward situation? China has absolutely no way to retreat. The one China principle is the fundamental principle that we must insist on. When the Democratic Progressive Party wants to promote Taiwan independence, how can we stop it? If the US really doesn't want conflicts with the Chinese in the Taiwan Straits, there are two ways. First, it should put pressure on the DPP, not allowing it to make trouble. If both the China and the US are against Taiwan independence, the DPP will chicken out. Second, the US should stop interfering. It should not intervene if China launches attacks against Taiwan secessionists. In that case, no conflict will arise between China and the United States in the Taiwan Straits. But the problem is the United States is instigating the DPP to provoke, continuously sending signals that Washington will offer support even if the island touches the bottom line, whilst at the same time it asks China to prevent the so-called competition between China and the US falling into conflict. We have to ask, is what China has done in the Taiwan Straits competition? We advise Washington to straighten out its logic. Political hooligan tactics cannot work with China. To prevent military conflicts between China and the United States and ensure 100% security, the United States must retreat from provoking China's core interests. As the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea has never been a problem, why do US warships always sail so close to China's islands and reefs? The South China Sea is so wide that lanes are everywhere. Why must they come to China's islands and reefs to find trouble? This is not navigation at all, but undisguised provocation and threats. The Chinese people have already seen it through. There is no way that we can talk to the United States with reason. We can only talk to the United States with strength and actions. I noticed that when Hyten said the United States should never go to war with China and Russia, he particularly mentioned that a war with a nuclear power is a bad thing. See, what the United States is really afraid of are the nuclear weapons of China and Russia. So, my conclusion is strong military strength, especially strategic nuclear power, has made the United States in deep awe of confronting China. under the condition that China doesn't proactively attack it, the United States knows that it should stick to the bottom line and not push China into a life and death fight with it. Therefore, as long as what China is doing is defending its core interests, China has the morality and nothing to fear. Now, here we see the Chinese both giving the United States advice, but also charting their way forward based on their assessment of US weakness. Because the Chinese are telling the Americans this: look, we have our red lines. We have our core interests. One of these core interests is Taiwan. That's absolutely fundamental for us. We are not going to retreat from this. As far as we are concerned, Taiwan is a part of our country. The authorities which purport to govern Taiwan have no authority, no legitimate authority. If they press ahead and move towards outright secession, we have no choice but to take military steps to bring them to heel and to reincorporate Taiwan into China. That is a core interest for us. It is non-negotiable. If the United States recognizes that, it will tell the authorities in Taiwan to hold off from pursuing secession. But if they nonetheless persist, despite heeding that advice, then the United States' best policy is to stay away, because China at that point will have to intervene in Taiwan to protect its core interests there. And if the United States tries to prevent it, then it will have a war on its hands, which it will lose, provided that war remains conventional. So that is a core interest of China. They're not prepared to negotiate with the United States about it. If the United States decides, however, to tell the authorities in Taiwan not to pursue secession, but to accept the status quo, a status quo which China finds unsatisfactory, but is prepared to live by, well, in that case, there is no need to be concerned and there is no need for conflict, because the Taiwanese authorities in that case will almost certainly understand that without the support of the United States, the idea of pressing for outright secession from China is not a realistic option for them. And if, of course, the United States goes further and tells Taiwan that the United States will not support Taiwan in the event of a military confrontation between Taiwan and China, well, at that point, the authorities in Taiwan might decide to take an even more realistic approach and might understand that some sort of rapprochement with China is in their own interests. So that's advice. That's China explaining its red lines, its core interests, giving the United States advice about how to handle the situation and how to accept the reality of China's red lines with respect to Taiwan. And the same goes for the South China Sea. Here, perhaps the problem is less extreme. All the United States needs to do is not involve itself directly in interfering in the various conflicts that China has with the various regional powers. These are being negotiated by China with those regional powers, with Vietnam, the Philippines, and all the rest. The United States has no need to send its warships into the South China Sea. China, for its part, is not looking for a fight there. But that is another core interest for China. If the Chinese feel that the US Navy is going out of its way to provoke them in the South China Sea, well, the Chinese will defend themselves, and that could start a new conflict, a conflict which does not impinge on any core interests of the United States. So the Chinese are setting out their red lines, and they are, by the way, red lines that I've discussed previously in other programs. I have said that the United States needs to accept at some point, if it is to avoid getting itself drawn into a disastrous confrontation with both China and Russia, it needs to understand that these countries have red lines and negotiate those red lines, accepting that the United States has red lines also, but pitching those red lines in a realistic way. And I think that if that policy is pursued, then realistic agreements can be reached. The United States can find ways of agreeing on red lines with China and Russia, and at that point we will have a genuine easing of tensions, and we see how the Chinese here in this article by who are setting out their position and setting it out carefully. But we also see how the Chinese are assessing American weakness. And the point Hu is making is a very simple one, actually. He says that the United States is terrified of nuclear war because it knows that if there is going to be a nuclear war, well, it will be, frankly, the end of the United States. And the fact of the US fear of a nuclear war deters the United States from engaging in conventional war against countries like China and Russia. So, logically, the correct thing for China to do in that instance is for China to increase its nuclear strategic deterrent capability. And that, of course, is precisely what China is currently doing, and that is precisely what is causing General Hyten to become so alarmed. So the Chinese, so long as they cannot agree with the Americans on these red lines, and for so long as the United States continues to, as the Chinese would say, provoke them by giving Taiwan, or at least the authorities in Taiwan, some impression that the United States might support them in their secessionist efforts and defend them if they got attacked by China. Given that that is so, given that the United States seems to be pursuing that kind of confrontation policy with China, China's best approach, its insurance against interference by the United States in any military action that China might feel itself obliged to take with respect to Taiwan, China's best insurance is to strengthen its nuclear deterrent capabilities. So the best way, and this is implicit in this discussion, for the United States to prevent this destabilizing growth in the Chinese nuclear arsenal from continuing is for the United States to come to the negotiating table and agree with China the red lines. And that means making concessions to China over the issue of Taiwan and the South China Sea along the kind of lines that the WHO has set out in this article. Well, it's a fascinating point because, in effect, what the Chinese are saying is that, to the United States, is that so long as the United States continues along its present course, China's response will be not just to increase its conventional forces, but to increase its nuclear deterrent capability, increasing ever further its nuclear weapons forces, and the United States has no control over them because China, unlike Russia, is not in any kind of strategic nuclear treaty arrangement with the United States as Russia is. In effect, what the Chinese are saying to the United States is that they will outproduce them in nuclear weapons unless the Americans come to terms. Of course, the United States could respond. It could start increasing its nuclear capability in response. It's not clear how that would solve its problems on the Taiwan Straits. the problem of a nuclear war with China in the Taiwan Straits would remain an awesome and impossible possibility. But in that case, also, if the United States were to increase its nuclear capability to match that of China, it would have to scrap its treaties with Russia. Russia would then presumably also increase its nuclear capabilities also, and the United States would then find itself in a nuclear arms race with two superpowers instead of one. Very difficult strategic dilemma for the United States, but you can see exactly what the Chinese are up to. And of course, General Hyten and Admiral Harris coming out and talking openly about the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war with China merely confirms to the Chinese the success of their nuclear strategy. Well, having said all of this, I'm going to make my quick observation, and it's the same observation I repeatedly and always make. The realists ultimately are right. The best thing for the United States to do is to push the neocons to one side and to seek agreement with the Chinese and the Russians about red lines, and to seek limits on conventional forces, limits especially on the development of naval forces and these very destabilizing naval nuclear weapons that the Russians in particular are deploying, even if that means accepting that the Russians and the Chinese have red lines about NATO expansion in Eastern Europe and possibly about the position of Ukraine, and the Chinese have red lines about the South China Sea and Taiwan. That seems to me to be the only sensible, logical, realistic policy that the United States can take. Any other policy would be exceptionally dangerous and would put the United States into an ever deteriorating and ever more dangerous position. The United States government, the administration, is clearly divided. On the one hand, the realists in the Pentagon, people like Admiral Harris and General Hyten, are making their concerns absolutely known, and the telephone call that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, made to Xi Jinping on Friday shows that some people in the White House are listening to what these senior military officials are saying. But we also see how the ideologues, the neocons, people like that, entrenched in the State Department, parts of the military, and also, I suspect, the intelligence community, are able to push back hard. And of course, they have the media and the think tank community behind them also. The big question today is which of these two parts of the US government are going to win out. Will it be the neocons or will it be the realists? Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly that as far as I can see, in all of these bureaucratic power battles that take place in Washington, the neocons in the end always win. And I'm afraid what that means is that we're going to see the Chinese nuclear build-up continue and accelerate. We're going to see the Russians, for their part, pressing ahead with their naval deployments in the North Atlantic and the Pacific, with the Poseidon missiles that I talked about in previous programs, and their nuclear-powered cruise missiles and all the other new weapon systems that they're bringing out. And we're going to see the United States in 5 years, perhaps 10 years, facing an extremely difficult military position. What the United States will try and do in response, whether it will intensify and accelerate its destabilization efforts against China and Russia as a way to try to ease this dilemma. Those policies, of course, those policies of destabilization, bringing with them even more problems and even more dangers? Well, we shall see. But it does seem to me that the United States is facing a difficult choice, and one which it shows no sign at the moment of grasping the only realistic choice which it can take. It is drifting into a more dangerous position, a more confrontational position, and one which promises no good for itself. But there we are. It's useful to see the divisions in the US government being highlighted in such a straightforward way. And it's helpful of Mr. Hu to set out China's position as clearly as he has done. Thank you for joining me for this video today. I look forward to you joining me in more videos for the future. Please also remember to join us on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on our new platforms, above all Locals, where I'm publishing an increasing amount of exclusive content. And also please check us out on the new free speech platform, SuperU. We have high ambitions for both of these platforms, and I should say that we also have a thriving community on Locals especially. And of course, there's also platforms, other platforms you can find us on, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rumble, and the rest. And lastly, please don't forget to go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there, our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. Support us if you can via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also, please, if you've liked this channel, remember to press the like button and to check the subscription to this video. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.